bringing you the spirits of our ancestors. Today, in history and healing in vòdún, practice, power, and value. Right, book title Transforming Vòdún, and the subtitle is Musical Change and Post-Colonial Healing in Benin's Jazz and Brass Band Music. Yes, sir. What do we got? Okay, here we go. History and Healing in Vòdún, Chapter 1. Page 4 out of 36. Let's get to it. Because of pre-colonial histories of kingdom building and inter-ethnic conflict, and colonial histories of vòdún denigration and suppression, ancestral traditions like vòdún evoke wide-ranging and often contradictory affective associations among musicians and listeners, depending on an individual's social and even temporal positionality. Thus, for jazz and brass musicians in the 2000s and 2010s, vòdún music and practice at times represent a sense of familial and community connection, or even an orientation toward anti-colonial Pan-African resistance, resilience, and pride. At other times, and from other positions, these same practices inspire feelings of ambivalence, alienation, suspicion, anger, and shame. Vòdún practice is the place where pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial traumas play out, the place where the tears in the social fabric are sewn back together to make survival, to make life possible again. By denigrating these practices as superstitious, backward, diabolical, and anti-modern, indeed by suppressing them and even rendering them formally illegal, the French colonists undermined the foundations of Dahomean social cohesion and inter-ethnic contestation. Music and ritual are particularly powerful media for working through these conflicting feelings, as they allow for multiple experiences simultaneously, providing the flexibility necessary to make sense of these divided selves. But this same power also makes music and ritual rites and ritual sites of extreme vulnerability and indeterminacy, which can be co-opted by actors coming from a variety of different positions, which is why vòdún practice comes with so many restrictions, taboos, and so much secrecy. The dynamics of global economic interdependence established in 19th century Dahomey set the stage for debates over contested independence and cultural autonomy in the colonial era. The empire's valorization of tradition, royalty, religion, and national culture, too, continued to resonate throughout the 20th century as traditional authenticity was continually reconstructed. Thus, French colonization's effects on the development of education, social class, and religious practice are equally as powerful a factor in understanding jazz and brass band musicians' attitudes about vòdún music and practice, as well as their thinking about the relative status and value of specific traditional, modern, and tradi-modern music genres. The relationship of the jazz and brass musicians in this study to the Republic of Benin's histories of power, religion, ethnicity, and music is complex. On the one hand, These musicians see the expressive traditions associated with Vodou religious practice as foundational connections to pre-colonial African values and ways of life, especially ideas about peace, healthy sociality, royal lineage, sovereignty, and the legacy and the legitimacy of African rule. They see these traditions as thus useful for their anti-colonial resonances. They see Vodou rhythms as the source of all Beninese traditional and popular music, and Vodou religious practice as the origin of incredible spiritual power, deserving of respect, whether this power is used for good or evil. On the other hand, these musicians are also acutely aware that the social cohesion that Vodou initiations facilitated, especially in kingdoms like the powerful, ethnically Fond Dahomey, today the inland city of Abomey, was founded upon hierarchical control and violence. This violence manifested itself in the wartime capture and subsequent forced cultural assimilations of people of other ethnicities, many of them drummers, Vodou priests, and women. Some captives were sold as slaves to the Europeans in order to increase the wealth and defenses of the kingdom, tying its economic well-being to global politics and economics. As I show, this violence was founded on the kingship's anxieties about cultural and biological reproduction, revealing a particular gendered subjectivity that was deeply concerned with projecting strength and longevity while hiding its dependence on violence and control to make this happen. The critical perspective on Vodou and official power reflects these musicians' particular positionalities as representatives of non-Fon ethnic groups like the Gun, the Hueda, the Tofin, the Tori, and the Maxi, who managed to survive or escape Dahomey's conquests in the past and are now based largely in the cities of the southern coast in Cotonou and Porto Novo. Each of these ethnic groups has its own familial traditions of Vodou worship that have existed in varying degrees inside or outside of the boundaries of royal control. Many of these musicians grew up in working class communities practicing one of these local or familial forms of Vodou, and later converted to Christianity, most often in an independent African congregation like the Cherubim and Seraphim Society or the Celestial Church of Christ, which blend Christian and Vodou liturgical materials. Thus, while Vodou music has historically been a tool for enforcing cultural hegemony and control, it has also been an important site of resistance to the inheritances of Fon ethnic hegemony through its expression in the musics of these ethnic minorities and new Afro-Christian blends. Trombonist Aaron Ahuanjinu of the Onala Brass Band explained that, while as a celestial Christian he does not practice it, Vodou comes in many forms and carries many names in Benin, depending on the ethnic and village context. It could also be referred to as Aziza or Yewe. For example, Aziza refers to the forest spirits that are the source of all divine creativity, including musicians' ability to improvise and compose. Yewe is similar in its usage to Vodou as a flexible term for God or deity. These musicians' perspectives, and especially their sensitivities to past and present power relationships, have led me to a focus on Vodou's political spiritual economy, by which I mean the ways that its music and other practices have been instrumental in the formation of political and spiritual power and value in Benin before and after colonization. These formations of power have rested on the kingship's use of vòdú to try to heal the traumas produced by ethnic conflict through the possibilities of cultural pluralism, even as this strategy also ultimately enforced foreign cultural hegemony. In this chapter and the next, I show how this historical analysis reveals much about why these musicians are so conflicted about the place of vòdú in their work and in Benin's national imaginaries, while also believing that vòdú music and practice must be an essential part of any project that seeks to represent Benin. Vòdú, drawing water from the source. Some background on vòdú practice is helpful here. Through my studies with vòdú drummers and practitioners in Abomey, I learned that the term vòdú refers either to the set of cults devoted to different divinities or to the divinities themselves. As a cosmology, it represents a way of understanding how power, spiritual or political or both, works in the world, and a set of tools for intervening in those power dynamics in a real way. Central to a vòdú-based view of the world is the idea of moral equilibrium, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, which underlies indigenous forms of justice and the maintenance of social cohesion. The vòdú can be understood within three categories, the first being ethnic, as in the case of the royal Towiyo, or founding fathers, Nesuwe, princes, or the familial ancestors, Tovodou. Another set are interethnic, as in the case of the great vòdú like Lisa, the twin of creator god Mawu, sometimes associated with Jesus Christ, Hevioso, the god of lightning and iron, sometimes called the older brother of the Yoruba god Ogun, Legba, the trickster, linguist, and mediator of the physical and spiritual, also the missionary's choice for a devil, and Sapata, the god of the earth and smallpox, a healer who both gives life and takes it away. A third category of vòdú are contemporary, as in the case of imported or charismatic new cults like Mamiwata, the sea or Tron, the kola nut, the majority of which arrived in the 1940s with migrant workers from Ghana and were involved in the then Dahome's nascent anti-colonial movement. Many great vòdú originally had specific ethnic origins, such as Fa from Oyo, Hevioso from Hevi, and Sapata from Dasa, before they were captured with their people and incorporated into the pantheon in Abomey. One of the vòdú's material manifestations is in their possession of vòdúnsi, the wives of the vòdú, women and some men who are devoted to a given divinity in the way a wife is devoted to her husband. When the vòdú inhabit these initiates, they are drawn to the drums and dance their signature dances, which identify them with insiders. The details of the ceremonies for each vòdú vary depending on which offerings that particular vòdú requires and the style of its relationship to its devotees. Importantly, each vòdú has a separate repertoire of songs and characteristic chants associated with it, and specific rhythms and calls that are played by the drumming ensemble. Other physical representations of vòdú include murals on the wall of temples, or as power objects, first called fetishes by the Portuguese, which form shrines and altars for sacrifices made to the deity. These shrines may be kept in a temple or in a covered hole in the ground. Over time, the layers of materials poured out on these figures form a kind of assemblage that becomes a permanent part of the vòdún itself. In this way, the layers of material that build up over time give an enduring and constantly renewed material reality, a life in this world to the spiritual being, through these pourings of devotion from its followers. The word vòdún has been in use since the time of Alada, as it first appears in print in the 1658 Aja language section of the Doctrina Christiana from King Philip of Spain, where the translators use it as the lowercase god, contrasting it with Mau for the proper noun, capital G, God. Scholars have much speculated on the etymology of the word vòdún, searching throughout the Aja language family, looking for resonances in the terms used in the Ewe, Fon, Aja, and Gun languages. Figure 2, the shrine for the familial vòdún in drummer and priest Etienne Mechonou's residence in Abomey. Photo by the author. So, scholars have much speculated on the etymology of the word vòdún, searching throughout the Aja language family, looking for resonances in the terms used in the Ewe, Fon, Aja, and Gun languages. The consensus points to a constellation of meanings surrounding the term vo as emptiness, hole, opening, and du as to draw water, to take rest. Vòdún is, in this etymology, an invitation to drink deeply, to draw water, life, rest, peace from the source, from the encounter with the unknown, opening oneself to divine mystery. It offers a source of power that can intervene in the anxieties and ruptures of human life, offering relief through the promise of a greater understanding of the spiritual connections that cross boundaries of time, place, and generations. The resonance of the first syllable vo, meaning hole or opening, also points to the Fon expression amonu jeme. You saw thing falling inside, meaning you have seen inside of the thing, or you understand. According to one story reported by Melville Herskovitz, the vòdún arrived in Dahomey under the reign of King Agaja. One jail, a woman from Aja, presumably meaning Alada, or going back even further to the city of Aja Tado, brought the vòdún so that women could give birth to human beings and animals could give birth to animals, regularizing cultural reproduction by regularizing biological reproduction. This could mirror the resolution of interfamilial disputes such as those between co-wives over royal succession. In this telling, the arrival of the vòdún enabled Agaja, heretofore childless, to father an heir to the throne. It was in this way that, according to myth, one Jil gave birth to the future king Tebesu. In essence, this origin story places vòdún at the center of the restoration of social order through ritual, healing the rifts caused by interfamilial and interethnic disputes, and ensuring the continuity of the royal line. Dahomey, Histories of Contestation. Dahomey was not the only kingdom in pre-colonial Benin, but it was for a long time the most powerful, and it invested a great deal in the maintenance of its histories especially its narratives of legitimacy. Because of its role as a slave trading kingdom and as a source of African diasporic cultures in the Americas, Dahomey has been one of the most intensively studied West African civilizations by historians of economics, art, religion, and politics. For example, in the work of anthropologist Melville Herskovits, art historian Suzanne Blair, and ethnomusicologist Gilbert Rouget. Dahomey's own oral historians also provide rich accounts of the kingdom's important conquests, personalities, and cultural contributions, usually through the lens of official royal sanction. The histories of the neighboring kingdoms of Alada, Ouida, and Zoponu are linked to Dahomey's through histories of lineage, schism, competition, and conquest. Particularly important in Dahomey's conquest of Ouida in the 18th century. While the value of power associated with Vodou music and practice were intertwined with the power dynamics that developed between rival kingdoms and between ethnic groups, Vodou's political spiritual economics also were shaped by the contested nature of the power dynamics that developed between African leaders and European traders. These dynamics centered on negotiations of trade, war, and religion, defined how Dahomey situated itself earlier on in a global economy and in relation to foreign culture. This set the stage for relationships of economic dependence and interdependence that continued after the slave trade was abolished in the 19th century, when Dahomey was colonized by the French. For followers of Vodou and other ancestral practices of southern Benin, one of the most effective ways of enacting social healing is through the ritual and musical telling of history, through multi-sensory narrative. Because it enacts and reenacts the process of making sociality and trust among peoples, the telling of history is a sacred ritual act in southern Benin's ancestral traditions. The institution of the Panlinga Royal Histories by King Webaja emphasizes just how central the telling of these historical narratives were to the making of the kingdom, a proto-national formation. As I observed at the ceremonies I attended in Abomey, the Panlingas sung storytelling, accompanied by the rhythms of the Gan double bells timeline, typically open ceremonies for the Vodou or the royal ancestors, then is followed by drumming, dancing, and singing to bring the Vodou spirits or ancestors to inhabit the bodies of their followers through possession. The Panlinga's opening of the ceremony is highly political and performative, regulated with great attention to the accuracy of the stories passed down through word and song in order to seal over those stitched up places and make sure that the story does its work in restoring social order, in feeding the ancestors, in making peace. In the past, a Panlinga's error could be punished by death because the performative act of speaking and singing the powerful names of past kings, the names of the deities they have become, has real spiritual effects in the world. The spoken word itself has incredible power. Uttering these spirits' names brings to life their political spiritual power and the histories of their control of their subjects and their resistance against European colonization. The task of my narrative here is analogous: to invoke the powerful ancestral names of the past in order to enliven the wisdom they may offer in the present, to pay my respects and my dues. I owe a debt to these histories, and so does the rest of the world. Debt, I have found, is a good heuristic for post-colonial work, and it is debt social, cultural, material, and spiritual that came to define Dahome's relationships with the Europeans over time. Examining Dahomean historical narratives reveals a great deal about how anxieties about wealth, power, lineage, and sexual and cultural reproduction were linked to religious and musical practice as the kingdom sought to establish its legitimacy. One of the originary One of the originary sources of the Dahomean king's insecurities was that they were not the first inhabitants of what is now Abomey. Rather, they migrated there after a split from the kingdom of Alada. This fissure alone is the source of much conflict and anxiety in Dahomey's history. The primary inhabitants of southern Benin prior to the 13th century lived in two groups. One was in the west on the Aladu Plateau, ethnically Ayizo or Aiza, and Tori, like the ancestors of former Gambe members, while the other was on the Ketu Plateau to the east, primarily Yoruba people who had arrived earlier on from the Oyo Empire and the city of Ilife. Historians of the region estimate that around the year 1300, the first Aja Fon settlers arrived in the western region, possibly from among the settlers in Ketu, and settled the city of Ajatado in present-day eastern Togo, integrating themselves with the existing population of Aizo farmers. As the origin stories go, the first royal ancestor, Towiyo Agasu, was born in Ajatado of the union of a woman, in some accounts the Princess Alibonon, and a leopard, who first appeared as a man from the east. This shape-shifting is a marker of extraordinary spiritual power and reflects the great awe and respect that Aja and Fon culture place on the ability to transform oneself between different manifestations and between different species. This founding union represents a profound moment of intercultural hybridity at the origin in Fon Aja collective memory, a hybridity that continued to be woven into the fabric of Dahome's self-making as time went on. The violent sexualized power of this mythical original hybridity is also key, as the Aja princess is depicted as embodied cultural capital itself, or put another way, as property to be appropriated and assimilated into the capital holdings of the lineage. The princess is the archetypical representation of a Vodou devotee, or wife of the Vòdún, who is possessed physically and spiritually by a Vodou spirit, a man from the east, suggesting a Yoruba man with unknown spiritual power. This founding story is highly suggestive of the ways that Dahomean rulers sought to reinforce their legitimate connections to the royal bloodline in the Aja princess, and to explain their own possible foreign, non-Tado links from Yoruba land. The first ancestor, Agasu's name, means the panther, and royal descendants today venerate him as a Tovodun, an ancestral deity. Among his offspring was Ajahuto, who killed the king in Ajatado and moved east to found the kingdom of Alada in present-day south-central Benin, sometime prior to the 1560s. The royal descendants of Ajahuto still perform ceremonies each year at his tomb in Alada. It is these ceremonies for the ancestors, particularly for royal ancestors, based on smooth lines of natural succession from father to son, rather than through coups and assassinations, that the Nigerian historian I.A. Akinjobin flags as the sign of the kingdom's good political spiritual health, which was disrupted by the pressures placed on the kingdom by trade with the Europeans in slaves and other gods. Let me take this again. It is these ceremonies for the ancestors, particularly the royal ancestors, based on smooth lines of natural succession from father to son, rather than through coups and assassinations, that the Nigerian historian I.A. Akinjobin flags as the signs of the kingdom's good political spiritual health, which was disrupted by the pressures placed on the kingdom by trade with the Europeans in slaves and other goods. Alada, called Ardra or Great Ardra by the British, is the name with great mythological resonance with the cultural unity of southern Dahomey Benin, and for the African diaspora as well. It represents a shared place of origin for all peoples of Ajah descent, among them the Fon in Abomey, the Gun in Porto Novo, and the Hueda in Ouida. Hueda is spelled Hweda, and Ouida is Ouidah, along with the Mina and the Ewe in present-day Togo and Ghana. These links were especially resonant for those of royal ancestry in Abomey, Alada, and Zobonu, who to this day refer to themselves as the Aladanu, those from Alada. The historical patterns of dispersion radiating out from Alada, along with other cultural practices, especially religion and language, unite this band of people across contemporary national boundaries along the southern coast. In Cuba and Haiti, religious practices of Arara and Rara trace their roots and names back to the ancestral kingdom of Alada. Thus, references to Alada in myth or song, as in Gabes Aladanu below, index the possibility of a unified identity for the linked languages and cultures of Benin, Togo, and Ghana's coastland, as well as their connections with the African diaspora, even as such references trace over the historical competitions for authenticity, power, and cultural dominance that have shaped these communities' relationships through the centuries. The story goes that Ajahuto, the founder of Alada, had two sons, Dobari and Dako, who after a quarrel left Alada in 1610 to settle to the north in the city of Abomey, later called Abomey. So the first Abomey, later called Abomey by the French. The first Abomey is Agbome, and then the French Abomey is Abomey. According to the oral record, Dako took charge of Abomey in 1625 and began the project to expanding Abomey's territory. By the time of his death, Abomey controlled an area of about 5 miles radius. It was this expansion that earned Dako the title of palm tree planter, the founder of the Abomeyan dynasty, although it was Dako's son, Webaja, who was typically considered the first true king of Dahomey. Dako brought the royal orchestra of Ajohun with him to Alada, which was at the time played exclusively for royal funerals, ensuring that members of the royal family would be deified as vòdún as their deaths. After their deaths, extending their power beyond the living world. At this time, religious practices centered around the veneration of the Towiyo, the royal ancestors, and the Tovodun, familial ancestral deities. These musical and spiritual practices reinforced the legitimacy of the kingship as the true link to Alada, even though the leaders of the rival kingdom of Zobonu saw themselves as equally legitimate. The foundation of Zobonu, Porto Novo. In my experiences living and working in Porto Novo, Zobonu, in the Gun language, during my fieldwork, several musicians' lives and cultural affiliations reflected their pride in the Porto Novian roots, especially for those like the Ahuanjinu family, among the founding members of a Gambe and Enyongle brass band, who come from Gun royal lineages. This was often reflected in the cultural and emotional distance they practiced from Abome and Fon culture in general. They and other Porto-Novian musicians also reflect the city's strong connections to Yoruba culture and their musical experiences, and its historical openness to European religion in their blended Afro-Christian liturgical practices. Several Porto-Novian musicians were weary of the amount of time I spent in Abome studying the Daomean kingdom and studying voodoo drumming. Gambe's brass band trombonist, Marshal Ahuanjinu, expressed something of the histories of rivalry between the two cities, saying obliquely, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to spend too much time up there in Abome." The kingdom of Zobonu in Porto Novo has its own origin story. According to oral history, another of Ajanu's sons, Te Ajanlin, left Alada around the same time as Dako in the early 1600s to establish a new kingdom in the southeast. At the place the long-time Yoruba inhabitants called Ajache or Ajashe. Adjatche or Adjashe, and which the Portuguese were calling Porto Novo. Let me take this paragraph again. The kingdom of Zobonu in Porto Novo has its own origin story. According to the oral history, another of Ajahuto's sons, Te Ajanlin, left Alada around the same time as Dako in the early 1600s to establish a new kingdom in the southeast at the place the long-time Yoruba inhabitants called Ajache or Ajashe, and which the Portuguese were calling Porto Novo. It was these people who became known as the Gun, from the Yoruba exonym Egun. The settlers from Alada gave Porto Novo the Aja name Zobonu, which is the name by which it is known to most of its Gun residents today. It is called the City of Three Names, representing its Ajagun, Yoruba, and Portuguese roots, Zobonu, Ajache, and Porto Novo, respectively. Like Dahomey, the kingdom of Zobonu claimed a direct line of descent from Alada, insisting that visitors address him as the king of Alada. The royal ceremonial practices of Ajogan, performed by the king's wives, recounted through song, drumming, and dance the story legitimizing Zobonu's ancestral lineage. Gilbert Rouget, writing about the king's court in Zobonu, says that court music was so important because the king could never rule without it. It enforces his power because he controls the instruments whose power is recognized. The reign of Wibaja, making Dahomey. Back in Abome, Dako's son Wibaja, 1650 to 80, took over a vastly expanded kingdom. His reign was an important one as he instituted many social changes, particularly related to the role of captured peoples in the kingdom and the regulation of vòdún practice and music. These changes were especially key to creating social cohesion because the previous generation split from Alada meant that Wibaja and those who came after him suffered from a chronic insecurity about the legitimacy of their power and their lineage. It was Wibaja who gave the empire of Dahomey in the belly of Da, the serpent vòdún, its name. Let me take that again. It was Wibaja who gave the empire of Dahomey in the belly of Da, the serpent vòdún, its name. He became a cultural hero in the colonial era, adding layers of detail and symbolic weight to the stories of his legacy. Argyle reports that many Dahomeans told him that it was Wibaja who made the country. One of Wibaja's successes was in finding ways of centralizing his power, including through music. Through his sponsorship of drumming ensembles, Wibaja was Dahomey's first patron of drumming styles like Ajoga and Doba, which he deployed in order to reinforce his power through giving honor to the ancestors in Alada, the ancestral source. Music was often a tool for social control throughout West Africa's history, and it reflected the hierarchical organization of the leaders who were its patrons. Paradoxically, this social control sometimes seemed to heal cultural divisions, but at other times this stitching together of social ties could be just as violent as the forces that separated people in the first place. Wibaja's reign represented a new and revolutionary form of power, grounded in ancestral spirituality, a state religion. My interviews with oral historian Gambin Jimase in Abome suggest that Dako's departure from Alada represented a truly significant break with traditional lineage and the link to the ancestors. According to Jimase, Wibaja stitched together his culturally heterogeneous kingdom of captives by basing his power in the appropriated spiritual traditions of his subjects, those who already lived in Abomian region and those captured in Dahomey's conquests. Wibaja revolutionized power. This power completely replaced what had been there before him. He understood that he had to rely on foreigners like himself. So when he brings people here who are not from here, these people owe him everything. He has the right to life or death over them. And very early they understood that this worldly power wouldn't have any force if it didn't rest on religious, spiritual power. So they organized, they institutionalized something that civilizations older than Dahomey hadn't had the chance to do: the institution of vòdún as state religion. I have often said they behaved exactly like the United States of America, Europeans who left for a new continent imbued with new knowledge and new discoveries from Europe, and later they took the independence that they had from the beginning. It's exactly like these people, what Dahomey did. They knew how to take what was interesting from the Ghanaian side, what was interesting from the Yoruba Nigerian side, and then that's it. It could be art, it could be religion. It's the same thing. Jimase's account evocatively describes Dahomey's approach to cultural assimilation and its strategic use of hybridity, particularly through the incorporation of the religious practices of conquered peoples, to create social cohesion and hegemonic power. Thus, vòdún lies at the heart of Dahomey's project of self-making in this era, including all of its attendant anxieties and revisions, as well as the relations of power it created with those in its sphere of influence, particularly those of other non-Fon ethnicities. The kings were known to allow particularly skilled artisans, such as those who joined the junto, or royal drummers, like literally drum, masters or fathers, to, craftspeople, tradesmen, or particularly powerful or feared bokono priests to install themselves and their practices alongside the others in Dahomey instead of being sold into slavery. This was the case with the family of one of my drum teachers, Clement Hunto, whose Yoruba ancestors were captured in the 19th century from the Oyo Empire and brought to work for the court in Abome. It was in this way that over time such a great diversity of vòdún came to Dahomey. Each arrived at some point as the god of a conquered people. Gambe Njimase described to me the process of cultural appropriation beginning during Webaja's reign as intimately tied to Dahomey's consolidation of power and conquest. Abome was the capital of the old kingdom of Dahomey, the all-powerful slaving kingdom. Slaving is an allusion to many conquests. And in the course of these conquests, the kings of Dahomey would bring back to Abome everything that they found interesting in the villages and cities that they would conquer. Everything interesting, everything that is art. And when they realize that you specialize in an art, a savoir-faire, that you have some knowledge that existed already in Dahomey, they put you in the care of those in charge of this knowledge in Dahomey. You will complement it. But if they realize that what you brought didn't exist at all, they set you up. They set you up. They build you a house. They give you children and wives and young people so that you can put your knowledge in the service of the kingdom. Let me take this paragraph again. I quite like it. Abome was the capital of the old kingdom of Dahomey, the all-powerful slaving kingdom. Slaving is an allusion, allusion, to many conquests. And in the course of these conquests, the kings of Dahomey would bring back to Abome everything that they found interesting in the villages and cities that they would conquer. Everything interesting, everything that is art. And when they realize that you specialize in an art, a savoir-faire, that you have some knowledge that existed already in Dahomey, they put you in the care of those in charge as this knowledge in Dahomey. You will complement it. But if they realize that what you brought didn't exist at all, they set you up. They build you a house. They give you children and wives and young people so that you can put your knowledge in the service of the kingdom. It is after having selected all these people that they select those who have a remarkable skill that they need. It is among those left that they choose those who can be subjected to trade, to be sold. The kingdom of Dahomey never discarded things of value, never. One could be sold as a slave or killed for insubordination against royal authority. Otherwise, if you have a value, you are preserved. Njimase's account here provides key information about the status of musicians as artisans in the Dahomean system, prized as skilled laborers, culture bearers, and powerful spiritual practitioners, structural roles that eclipsed the value of their humanity alone. In essence, Dahomey's system of valorizing the cultures religions, and talents of those they captured was grounded in the value of religious and cultural difference. In this context, then, hybridity and its stitching together was a strategy of enforcing a centralized power based in the king's ability to assimilate any number of beliefs and cultural practices into his ruling cosmology. The power to define difference and sameness, and to produce or suppress hybridity, their coexistence, a contradiction in terms, is in essence the power to control a society's epistemology, something the French colonists also exploited to their benefit during the early 20th century. I'll take that paragraph again. In this context, then, hybridity and its stitching together was a strategy of enforcing a centralized power based in the king's ability to assimilate any number of beliefs and cultural practices into his ruling cosmology. The power to define difference and sameness and to produce or suppress hybridity, their coexistence a contradiction in terms, is in essence the power to control a society's epistemology, something the French colonists also exploited to their benefit during the early 20th century. Buyers and sellers, the slave trade. Triangle trade. There were buyers and sellers. How can you have a buyer without a seller? The slave trade is one of the major traumatic events in southern Benin's historical relationships, not only with the Europeans and their descendants, but also with the African diaspora, and in divisions of mistrust between Beninese people of different cultural backgrounds. Whether their ancestors captured and sold slaves, or whether they themselves fled to safety, Beninese people grapple with the history and memories of the slave trade in one way or another. Music, ritual, and art in various forms are helpful in working through these traumas, in sewing up the wounds, but the scars remain, often hidden away. The lasting effects of the traumas of the slave trade are spiritual and emotional, but they are also economic. Slavery became so important to Dahome's economy over time, and so defined its relationships with its neighbors and with Europeans, that it is not possible to consider the kingdom's history without it. Because of the difficulty of landing on the shores near Grand Popo, west of Ouidah, it was not until the mid-16th century that traders began exploring this area surrounding the Mono River. Alada was the reigning kingdom at this time, and the Portuguese started to steady trade in slaves. From there, around the 1560s, the British, Dutch, Portuguese, French, and Spanish all competed for the rights to trade in Alada until in the 1680s, all of the major European trading powers obtained permission to set up forts in Ouidah. Ouidah was declared a neutral port, accessible to all of the traders. The role of Africans in the slave trade has understandably been a contentious issue in historical research, particularly since this issue traces the lines of the traumas of betrayal, guilt, and complicity that were made even more acute during the colonial experience. Aking Jobim has suggested that King Agaja conquered Alada and Ouidah in the 1720s in order to control the coastal slave trade, to reduce or to eliminate it, or to at least make sure that Dahomey was not strong-armed into obtaining captives solely to satisfy European demand. But the record shows that while he did then manage to monopolize the slave trade, Agaja was ultimately not able or willing to stop it, and his successors expanded the trade even more and developed new ways of catching slaves and raiding villages, tying the economic fate of the kingdom directly to the international trade in slaves. Slave trading worked rather well as a source of income for some time until Agaja's successor, Tebesu, and the slave trade continued to be profitable even when Dahomey became a protectorate of the Oyo Empire from 1730 to 1790. But Tebesu prioritized the slave trade over agriculture and maintaining Dahomey's army, and the supply of slaves ultimately became difficult to maintain, especially under Oyo rule. King Jobin reports that after Tebesu, King Pengla was forced to begin raiding neighboring Yoruba villages like Ketu. Economic reality truly began to set in with the abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century, which began by the British in 1807. Historians agree that in addition to the injustice, violence, and exploitation the slave trade demanded, and the mistrust that it produced between kin, it was also a profoundly unsustainable enterprise for the Dahomeans as it depopulated the region, leaving few laborers to produce agricultural crops. It also tied Dahomey's economy too closely to external political factors outside of its control, such as the legality of the slave trade and the control of the trade by Europeans. In fact, it nearly broke the king's social contract with their subjects as economic times became more and more trying at the close of the 18th century. Excuse me. Zenli and Sapatahun, reinforcing and contesting power through music and ritual in 18th century Dahomey. Vòdún often contributed to the king's consolidation of power, and music was instrumental to this process. Herskovits describes this taking place with the importation of the Fa divination system to Dahomey under the reign of Agaja in the early 18th century. The king borrowed the system from Nago Yoruba traders with the intention of discrediting the local Bokono, who had fallen into disfavor. Along with the importation of Fa divination came its associated musical repertoires, which developed into the style of Zenli, which reinforced the king's power as it came to be used in royal funerals. The funeral repertoire of Zenli developed under King Agaja around the time the Vodou arrived in Abome. This is the style that appears in Gambe's brass band's 2001 piece Ajaka on the album Tobe, later recorded in 2015 as Les Petits Souris, or Go Slow to Lagos. It came out of a context of musical and ritual innovations inspired by anxieties about lineage and the longevity of the Dahomean kingdom. This is a song of the Dahomean royal court, which Gambe adapted for brass and percussion in the traditional Zenli style for royal funerals. The song speaks about the importance of producing heirs to continue the power of the kingdom and to continue cultural continuity and reproduction. For contemporary Beninese listeners, the song inspires national pride for ethnically formed histories, for the pre-colonial past, and for the heritage of the Dahomean Empire in Benin. Gabi Njimase suggested that Zenli received a great deal of patronage under King Agonglo, who borrowed the style of drumming from the repertoire for Fa divination and called on it to resolve his problem with procreation. Ovima Yondani Kadi na yese vi mayon dani kadise ohaya hi, do, mewenu, ase, oha, aja, hi, me. You must have your own child. Mama, it's very bad not to have your own child. Singing in the right time. Singing when you are feeling good. Oha, mala, agaja, mala, tebesu. Do, vima, yon, dani, kadise. Singing the praise names of Agaja and Tebesu. You must have your own, brother. Gambe Brass Band Ajaka Tobe 2001. Zenli began in the 18th century as a style played on a limited set of instruments, without the gan, bell, and the asan shakers, two calabashes of different sizes and tones turned over to resonate in pails of water that played the accompanying rhythms, and a large gourd that both kept time and played lead parts with a flat, flexible paddle, producing a deep vibration. This paddle resembled the fa used to seal the tombs of the ancestors, according to the modern Zenli artist Leroy Alepanhu. Zen is the fan and Li the tomb. Zenli continued to be played in this style until the reign of King Gwezo. When the king requested that his son, the future king Glele, organize a Zenli orchestra for the funeral of his close friend Tomelin, Glele decided to introduce some innovations into the Zenli formula to surprise his father. A few days in advance of the funeral, he brought in a couple of bezin drums made of clay with skin heads that are capable of producing great variety of timbres at great volumes. From deep resonances to sharp cracks, he taught the orchestra a new rhythm, adding the pezi along with asan and ga to go along with the old one, played on the large gourd and the calabashes. Glele's father was very pleased with the rhythm when he heard it on the day of his friend's funeral, and called it Zenli Bli Bli, a Zenli that was much more majestic and moving than it had been before. Gwezo requested that this style be played at his own funeral. This new style of Zenli became popular throughout the region of Abome for funerals around the late 19th century. See Chapter 3 for its transcription of Zenli rhythms. The power of Vodou music and practice was not limited to the royal court. However, in fact, sometimes powerful Vodou from outside the royal pantheon served to counteract and contest the power of the monarchy. The Sapata cult, for example, whose Vodou represents a king who had died of smallpox, was among the most feared by several monarchs because of this Vodou's power over life and death. In fact, according to Argyll, 1966, it was originally prohibited for Sapata temples to be located within the city of Abomey itself, because this Vodou might see the earthly Abomeyan king and become offended at his arrogance. Some accounts tell that drumming for Sapata was at first not allowed in Abome because of this Vodou's incredible power. Figure 3 here shows Etienne Mechonu, Vodou priest and drummer for the royal house of Pengla during a lesson on Sapatahu in 2013 in Abome. Photo by the author. The drumming, dancing, and singing that accompanied Vodou ceremonies in Dahomey were integral to the kingdom and its subjects' understanding of spiritual efficacy and political power. Let me take that again. The drumming, dancing, and singing that accompanied Vodou ceremonies in Dahomey were integral to the kingdom and its subjects' understanding of spiritual efficacy and political power. The rituals would not function without the music's power to summon the Vodou, and so changes in musical style correspond with changes in religious practice and reflected the contested power relationships that Vodou worked to negotiate. While Vodou music and practice were tools for the Dahomean kings to reinforce their power and legitimacy, the worship of other Vodou outside of the royal court could also be a powerful way of contesting royal power and fond cultural hegemony. Vodou and resisting Dahomean hegemony. Dahomey's history of cultural appropriation has obscured the fact that often the cultural and spiritual practices of other peoples survived the kingdom's efforts to assimilate them completely. A majority of the musicians I worked with come from the non-Fon ethnic groups like the Gun, Nago Yoruba, and the Tofinu, and bring these traditions to their recording projects. Histories of ethnic minorities provide a closer look into the cultural pluralism and contestation located largely in musical and religious practices that existed going back to the 17th century. The French anthropologist Paul Mercier writes that if certain cults were to some extent kept in the background, it was because their power overshadowed the prestige of the monarchy. The kings did, however, define and modify in areas recently conquered the relative status of cult groups, reserving the highest place for the spiritually royal cults, Towiyo and Tovodou. Herskovits speculates that as Dahomey expanded its influence in the 18th century, it exercised its control more strongly in Abomey, Alada, and Ouida. But in small villages, spontaneous worship and possession were beyond the purview of the monarchy. In oral histories, clans' origins seem to fall into one of the two categories. First, those with the founder who came down from the sky. For one account, see Herskovits, 1958. Or up from the ground. And second, those with origins in the offspring of the union of humans with animals or plants, like the royal lineage of the Dahomeans. In my interviews with Gabi Jimase, he explained that the clans in the first of these groups were the original inhabitants of the Abomean region, because mythological accounts continually cite the arrival of newcomers, new material goods, and at some loosely historicized point of intervention, the arrival of new forms of political organization. In some accounts, the acculturating activities went both ways, as the original inhabitants or new captives introduced Abomeans to worship of the great Vodou, and the resulting combination of belief systems formed the beginnings of the Dahomean pantheon as it was subsequently passed down. The power of the monarchy worked to incorporate still more belief systems through the spoils of conquest, and then to homogenize these systems as much as possible, but many traces of their outsider traditions remain, particularly in the case of borrowed Yoruba traditions like Ifa, Ofa, divination, and the Egungun masks. It may be that the chief alternative to official Dahomean history exists in the mythological accounts of the cults of the Lesser Vòdún that were established among the original inhabitants of Abomey. There was certainly resistance to the centralization of Dahomean power, and those peoples who were not captured or sold into slavery fled, forming pockets of resistance throughout the region. A few examples are the Ouida, who escaped the conquest of Ouida and formed camps to the east and west of the city, periodically attacking the Abomean occupiers, the Weme, W-E-M-E, who took refuge in the river valley, giving their name to the river, and Benin's most eastern province. The Gun, who moved east and settled in Porto Novo and Badagry in contemporary Nigeria, and the Tofinu, who built villages around Lake Nokue, the best known of which is Gavi, where they were led by a voodoo spirit in the form of a crocodile who now protects the village. It is largely musicians from these communities, especially the Gun, the Yoruba, and the Tofinu, who have been the most actively engaged in tradi-modern projects that modernize Benin's traditional music, and which I discuss in this book's case studies. Many of these Gun and Yoruba descended communities were protected by the influence of the nearby dynasty in Zobonu. Many of the Gun kingdom's specialities was the Zambeto, secret police, guardians of the night in Gun, directed by the king's Miga and minister executioner. Zambeto are spirits covered in raffia that patrol Porto Novo at night to catch witches and spies. The Zambeto secret society uses kaka drumming for their ceremonies, played with many interlocking bell patterns and the distinctive dry cracking sound of bamboo sticks, which drummer Sabohan Danielu modernized in the early 1970s. Those communities that were protected by the Zobonu Empire were able to keep their local traditions and practices while adopting the Gu Empire's resistance to Dahomean cultural hegemony. Missionization and resistance. The spiritual practice of Vodun was also a central site for contesting European power during the pre-colonial period. This is essential for understanding the ways that these religious traditions and the values attached to them have continued to serve as primary places where problematic relations of cross-cultural power are worked out. The kings of Dahomey, Alada, and Ouida largely resisted the influence of foreign religion until the beginning of colonization, except when appearing to consider conversion benefited them politically or economically. The first Catholic missionaries arrived in the region in the mid-17th century. Fearful of Abomey's encroachment on trade on the coast, Tosonu, then king of Alada, sent an emissary to Spain in 1658 requesting the sending of Christian missionaries and the establishment of trade relations. Tellingly, the missionaries found that the king was more interested in a commercial relationship than in converting the Christian. Tellingly, the missionaries found that the king was more interested in a commercial relationship than in converting to Christianity, especially when he learned that Christianity did not allow him to continue practicing polygamy or venerating the ancestors and the vòdún. Within 2 years, all but 2 of the missionaries had died, likely of malaria, and the survivors returned to Spain with reports of Portuguese-speaking Christians at Alada. Attempts to convert King Abangla of Ouida in the 1680s ended similarly, but with perhaps more direct spiritual intervention. Abangla had considered being baptized, and the French sent 2 Capuchin missionaries to see him. They stayed for 3 years, but opponents from the temple for the serpent Dambe, Ouida's major ethnic vòdún, burned down their chapel, and Abangla had a change of heart. Due to the opposition and considerable political power of institutions such as vòdú temples and the veneration of ancestral traditions, Catholic missionization made very little progress during the 17th and 18th centuries in Dahomey. Thus, the first sizable community of practicing Catholics in the region was actually formed by a wave of Brazilian ex-slaves who returned to Dahomey, Benin in the 19th century in especially large numbers following the massive revolt in Bahia in 1835. They settled in Ouida, Porto Novo, and Lagos. Some were of mixed European and African heritage, while others were Portuguese. They formed a community of literate Christian merchants who kept mostly to themselves in the so-called Brazilian quarters. These Brazilian returnees were instrumental in transforming the religious and cultural character of Dahomey's southern cities. The Brazilians made a mark on Dahomey Benin's soundscape through their Afro-Brazilian musical traditions, which fused Yoruba and Aja traditions with some of their own 17th century Portuguese practices. While introducing new sounds from other parts of Africa like Congo and Angola. Among the most prominent of these traditions is the bourrian, a parade genre of drumming associated with elaborate masks that is frequently performed in Ouida, and which are documented in several video recordings with the assistance of Jean L'Enfant. A Catholic mission school was opened in Ouida in 1861, primarily to serve the Brazilian community there, headed by Father Francesco Borgero, a priest of Italian descent who had been sent by the Catholic Church in Lyon, France. Drawing on Borgero's journals, Martin Ballard outlines the details of the priest's initial encounter with King Glegle in Abome, which appears to have been something of a competition in ceremonialism, with each man trying to outdo the other in a show of performative protocol. Among other demands, Borgero apparently reacting to the ubiquitous Legba shrines to the trickster vòdún outside many palaces and homes in Abome, insisted that all fetishes and superstitious objects be kept out of his sight wherever he passed. Ronin reports that the mission in Ouida was struck by lightning in 1871, which residents of Ouida attributed to the disapproval of Hevioso, the vòdú of thunder and lightning, toward the new mission. Protestantism began to have some influence in Porto Novo through the work of English Methodists, beginning in 1843. Importantly, Porto Novo felt the influence of mainline British Protestant missions more than other parts of southern Benin over time, with missionary activity in Nigeria increasing when it became a British colony in 1900. These Protestant churches formed the foundation for independent African churches like the Celestial Church of Christ, l'Église de Christianisme Céleste, and Cherubim and Seraphim Society that were founded in the late 1940s and are still very active. The independent churches later formed an important zone of resistance to Catholicism, and indeed to French colonialism and culture more generally, especially through their use of vòdún-derived music and ritual, continuing these practices' role in negotiating power and the maintenance of social ties. 19th century Dahomey, from slave trade to slave labor. The reasons for mighty Dahomey's fall to the French have been much discussed by historians. A central factor was Dahomey's economic dependence on the global trade in human lives, one of the primary points of origin for post-colonial trauma in Dahomey and Beninese society. Dahomey was so economically dependent on the slave trade that its abolition in the 19th century was a serious threat to its power and sovereignty, and resulted in increasingly desperate tactics to capture slaves, including a shift toward raiding Yoruba villages. By the end of the 19th century, it became evident that this dependence on slave trade was ultimately the source of Dahomey's weakness. In their attempts to heal this historical trauma, then, Beninese jazz and brass band musicians find that they must confront not only Europeans' hypocritical justifications for slavery and later colonization, but also African leaders' complicity in these traumas and their outcomes for global power relations. As the transatlantic slave trade declined, Dahomey began shifting its economy, beginning in the 1840s, toward the slave labor mode of production, specializing in goods that could be produced by slaves locally and sold internationally. These practices of forced labor created further fissures, resentments, and inequalities within southern Beninese society. Dahomey did not quickly abandon the slave trade, however, despite efforts by the British to establish a treaty with King Gwezo, and Europeans continued to seek ways to control the African economy. The French continued to exert their influence on Porto Novo, and in 1882 they established their protectorate there, signing a treaty with King Tofa, which he hoped would allow the kingdom of Porto Novo to rise above Dahomey with the support of the French. This alliance, along with Dahomey's weakened economic state, opened the way for the French to conquer the once powerful empire in 1894. The conflict lasted for 2 years, during which King Behanzin burned the city of Abomey to the ground and fled into the bush. The French eventually captured him in 1896 and sent him into exile. Behanzin today is lifted up as an anti-colonial hero for having resisted the French for 2 years. He is the focus of the climax of many palace ceremonies in Abomey, and his legacy continues to live on in oral tradition as well as ritual practice. Dahomey was one of the last African empires to fall to the French army in West Africa, largely due to their highly trained fighting forces. Today, a large statue depicting King Behanzin, with his hand raised to stop the intruding French forces, stands in Place Goho in one of the major intersections in Abomey. With French colonization beginning in 1894, the double colonial missionary phenomenon was no longer an ad hoc operation that could be set back by illness, lightning, or misfortune, but one that made the occupation and transformation of Dahomey an explicit and systematic goal. Let me take that sentence again. With French colonization beginning in 1894, the double colonial missionary phenomenon was no longer an ad hoc operation that could be set back by illness, lightning, or misfortune, but one that made the occupation and transformation of Dahomey an explicit and systematic goal. The colonists' denigration of traditional practices for the vòdún and as anti-Christian, anti-modern, diabolic, and superstitious targeted the ancient social structures so carefully and intentionally reinforced throughout Dahomey's history, tying together vòdún practice, the ancestors, and the kinship. As the theologian Barthélemy Adukonu writes, the arrival of colonial religion introduced a profound contradiction and tensions at the heart of the formative traditional four social principles. Yet, as resistance to colonization gathered strength, it became clear that this break with the ancestors, as devastating as it was, would never be entirely complete. Vòdún and colonial power. It was and is the nature of colonial power, being founded in its own insecurities, to maintain impossible contradictions of policy and action. The colonial project sought, for example, to say that that traditional African cultural practices like vòdún were by turns a diabolical, powerful threat to Christian life. Then without value, power, or history, and worthy of shame, and soon after the subject of colonial ethnographic studies that reconstructed the value and authenticity of these African traditions on European terms. All of these were attempts to justify a power relationship that was ultimately untenable and self-destructive. The Enlightenment ideal of universal human rights clearly did not extend to the subjects of France's colonies. The contradictions and the resulting violence that formed the core of the colonial project were reflective of Europe's own insecurities about the scarcity of resources in the face of the transition to modernity and industrialization, insecurities that they projected in mirror form onto colonies like Dahomey. Beginning in 1894, French colonization sought, with uneven result, to break down traditional social structures around kinship and vòdún practice. The very places where Dahomey's Aja descended people had, over arduous centuries, constructed the social fabric that held them together across differences of ethnicity and power. These colonial interventions impacted Dahomean attitudes regarding culture, religion, and socioeconomic class in ways that have continued to resonate throughout music-making practices and the fluctuating valorization of traditional culture into the 21st century. Yet, anti-colonial resistance continued to be strong in Dahomey in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, especially in the form of new independent African churches and new vòdún cults, which became important sites for counteracting the cultural effects of colonial domination. Assessing the long-term cultural effects of colonization is difficult because they seem so complete in some areas like language, education, and law. At the same time, in other areas like music, dance, and ritual, many African expressive systems have continued to develop and change on their own terms and in dialogue with pre-colonial histories and traditions, as well as with the traditions of the African diaspora. Yet, these traditions, too, have been refracted through colonial ideologies of cultural authenticity. The new divisions of social class that colonization created had particularly deep effects on Dahomean society, culture, music, and religious practices. While the French state was adept in its campaign to control and transform Dahomey's culture through education, religion, politics, economics, and the law, the people of Dahomey also had multiple outlets to act in oppositional or cooperative strategic response. Vòdún already acted as a form of resistance to colonization in earlier encounters with Europeans. A central feature of the colonial project was the French state's legal support for the traumas of rapid and violent cultural change, particularly in education and religion, which explicitly undermined the value and self-determination of African traditions like vòdún and local languages. As time went on, Dahomeans negotiated the terms of new colonial power relationships, for example, and the creation of independent African churches, which were the sites of new traditions of vòdún-based music, ritual, and healing. Activity in these areas beginning in the 1920s laid the groundwork for the Africanization of colonial traditions like Christianity and brass bands that took place after independence. Early French rule and the first revolts. The French, with little regard for ethnic divisions, included within the boundaries of the colony of Dahomey a large expanse of territory to the north that was not part of the culturally unified Aja South. These northern regions were inhabited by the Bariba people, along with several other ethnic groups who had, up until this point, had little cultural interaction with their southern neighbors or with Europeans for that matter. Not surprisingly, the first revolts against the colonial state took place in the north in the Atakora and Borgu regions, where French influence had been felt only sporadically until this point. Bariba society was structured quite differently from the south. Spiritual practice was not part of state power for the Bariba as it was for the kingdom of Dahomey, although the Bariba ruling class, the Wasangari, participated in Bori spiritual practices which are widespread across the Sahel region in Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. In the first few decades of colonization, roads, railroads, and a few public schools were developed using the revenue collected from the imposition of a head tax. But some 1/3 of this revenue was sent out of the country to France, effectively stripping Dahomey of a great deal of its economic output over the course of the colonial period. The effects of this policy in terms of economic dependence continue into the present day, as the scarcity of income in sefa currency remains a chronic problem, while local systems of more informal credit and exchange are still functional. The French governed the economic center of Cotonou and the port of Ouidah themselves. Cotonou was a small Tofinu village before the French began their administration, but underwent heavy development during the colonial period and became the center of industrial activity, and now, in the 21st century, an African metropolis. In 1905, the French incorporated Dahomey into Afrique Occidentale Française, whose capital was in Dakar, and this remained the governmental structure for most of the rest of the colonial period. Dakar's cultural policy, particularly regarding constructions of African authenticity, assimilation, development, and autonomy, became one of the main sites of ideological contestation in the colonial period, as power relations shifted between the educated évolués, traditional chiefs, and colonial administrators. The division of Dahomey into cantons and the substitution of French administrators for traditional rulers was a blow to the foundations of the traditional Aja society's social structure, uprooting the connection with the ancestors in Alada that the Dahomean kings had so carefully cultivated and on which they had staked the legitimacy of their rule. But in music and spirituality especially, the effects of colonization were not complete. dividing their conception of power into sacred and secular realms. The French misunderstood the real spiritual power that the Dahomean ancestors and the vòdún in general continued to wield in the world. Ronan writes that since the French assumed that the European category of kinship applied to someone as powerful as the Dahomean head, thus kinship in Europe was the same as kinship in Dahomey. So, breaking down the kingdoms and stripping the heads of their titles was thought to be equivalent of the elimination of traditional authority, thereby making way for the easy substitution of French colonial authority. These administrative and political measures, however, disrupted the traditional system only where and when the religious function of those responsible to the holy places in Abome and Alada was threatened, and later when the dual roles of the village chief, Tohosu, traditional plus representative of the colonial authorities in the eyes of its inhabitants, came into conflict. Traditional spiritual authority outside of the ancestral kingdoms was more difficult to break, since it tended to lie in the worship of the great vòdún like Hevioso and Sapata, rather than the royal cults of Towiyo and Nesue. This was because these voodoo practices, the heritage of minority peoples who had been conquered under Dahomey, remained under the authority of village chieftaincy, which still existed outside of the French state structure. Their power remained strong until the French tried to break the nationalist movement that began in the 1920s, and when a new political elite, educated in Catholic schools, came to rise above the traditional chiefs. It was precisely the connection between the spiritual and the political that the French authorities failed to see, in large part because they saw only political authority in the kings and chiefs, failing to grasp how effective the spiritual power was among the people. Let me take that again. It was precisely the connection between the spiritual and the political that the French authorities failed to see, in large part because they saw only political authority in the kings and chiefs, failing to grasp how effective their spiritual power was among the people. In the larger historical picture, the groundwork for future post-colonial Africanizations of colonial traditions was laid in these early years of French rule. The most powerful area of the colonial state's interventions in local religious practices was in the colonial justice system, particularly the system of courts known as the indigena, which tried cases involving the indigenous population separately and using a different set of laws from those involving the French. This was a particularly serious affront to traditional knowledge systems, where indigenous systems of justice based in community-oriented values and specific cosmologies of moral equilibrium were a central part of the social order. Under the French, fetichism, that is, traditional religious practice, was made officially illegal, as were the activities of traditional secret societies like the Zambeto and Oro. There is archival evidence of the persecution of Vodou priests in the religion section of the Archives Nationales in Porto Novo. These files specifically contain documents from the 1915 pursuit of a Vodou priest named Zonu Aisu on charges of fetichism, after the priest fled Ouida to avoid being involuntarily conscripted into the French army to fight in World War I. The archives also show that other Vodou or Afro-Christian religious activities, particularly public demonstrations involving drums and dancing, were subject to a system of regulations and permits, often called autorisation de tam-tam or drumming authorization, throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Similar to the regulations imposed on second-line parades and early 20th century New Orleans and Carnival in the Afro-Caribbean. These regulations reflected the colonizers' anxieties about the power of these traditions and the expressive practices deployed in their public demonstrations, perceiving quite correctly that these were affronts to the colonial project that, due to the performative and encoded nature, constantly challenged the form and function of the law. This was a crucial piece of the guilt and devaluation that developed for many colonized Dahomeans surrounding traditional culture. The feeling that they could always be prosecuted or caught for practicing voodoo without authorization, that if they could practice those traditions, that it was only with the permission of the state, and that ultimately those traditions were of lower value and should be the source of shame and judgment. While colonizers denigrated local culture by destroying voodoo shrines or placing regulations around ceremonial drumming and dancing, the most profound social changes were instituted at the psychological level through the missionaries' education system. The Catholic schools became a marker of class difference, as they were preferred by upper-class families, especially the Brazilians. The missionaries focused on drawing their African students out of fetishism and superstition, leading them to become the spiritually, economically, intellectually enlightened subjects that the colonial state required. The students in the mission schools were to become subjects of modernity, simply put. This meant speaking exclusively French in the classroom. French remains the exclusive language of instruction in schools run by both the church and the government in Benin to this day. And students can be wrapped across the knuckles for speaking their native languages in the classroom. The missionaries also imposed other codes of behavior regarding dress and restrictions on playing traditional drums and dancing, which they perceived as overtly sexual in nature. Colonial class binaries and their constructed homogenies of the elite, educated évolué, and the native indigene. Further, it complicated many of the pre-existing divisions of ethnicity and power that already existed in Dahomey. Colonial teachers and administrators encouraged the educated elites to see themselves as separate from the native population, occupying a privileged place at the vanguard of Africa's cultural evolution. Thus, the population was divided by language, by education, by religious worship, by socialization, and by music and dance. By keeping the categories of European and African, elite and vernacular rigidly separate, and by defining cultural authenticity as cultural purity, the administration throughout the French colonies was able, for a time, to control the colonized populations and prevent them from obtaining the numbers or the information necessary to organize resistance. The Dahomean national movement. Dahomey's position as a highly resistant, politically active colony with few natural resources other than its coastline, along with its relatively late incorporation into French West Africa, gave it a unique status that made it difficult to govern and routinely forced concessions from the French administration. It became clear to Dahomeyans earlier on that the colonists' ambitions were economic as well as political. When finances became tight for the French during World War I, they imposed new head taxes on the Dahomean population, increased prices on imports, and began recruiting soldiers for the Tirailleurs Sénégalais infantry force among the population. This was part of the program outlined in the colonial minister Albert Sarraut's La mise en valeur des colonies françaises, the development or placement of value of the French colonies. in which he argued for the moral and ethical imperatives for the economic development of the colonies, making them profitable to France. Words like mise en valeur, development, and value were all characteristic of the doubleness of colonial rhetoric. These policies inspired some of the most widespread revolts of the colonial era. These rebellions took place at all levels of society, from fishermen on the coast to agricultural workers in the river valleys to the north, where the Bariba were outraged at the new taxes and French economics policies in general. The landed and commercial bourgeoisie and the elite intelligentsia began producing and distributing anti-colonial literature, confirming the colonial administration's suspicion of their radical potential. The most dramatic of these incidents involved the events in Porto Novo in 1923, when, in response to attempts to withhold taxes from wages, residents closed down markets and refused to pay any taxes for 6 weeks. The workers went on strike. The French responded by burning the nearby lake village of Afotonu and sent the leaders of the strike into exile in Mauritania. In the hopes that it would make the colonies easier to govern, the French West African leadership in Dakar instituted councils in each colony, each composed of 8 to 16 members who were given French citizenship. With councils established in Alada, Abomey, and Ouida in 1919, and in Cotonou in 1924, this heightened the separation of an elite class of Francopholic, educated, largely Catholic Dahomeans who would eventually take over political power. An important site for the development of the Dahomean national movement in the domain of culture was in independent African churches. A series of outbreaks of bubonic plague and influenza in the 1920s led to the creation of Dahomey's first independent African church, the Cherubim and Seraphim Society in 1925. Modeled on the Nigerian Protestant missions, this new church was created out of necessity to offer healing to those afflicted by disease, but who, influenced by the colonial denigration of traditional African practices, feared traditional healers whom they associated with superstition and witchcraft. Musically, this new church, or healing society as Membed preferred to call it in its early years, was also key in developing an early type of modern music through borrowings from Brazilian street drumming, burian from Brazilian returnees to Ouida, and Nigerian asiko, a Christian genre of street drumming that came to Lagos via Brazilian and Sierra Leonean ex-slaves. In Nigeria, the independent churches employed dundun and gangan, squeeze drums, for their lead parts, because the bata were seen as closely associated with Orisha music. In Benin today, the bon, another talking drum, plays this role. This mix of styles in the independent churches was a major ingredient in the formation of the brass band scene in Benin in the 1990s, and several key brass players, particularly in the Gnon L'Enfant Fon family, got their musical start in this community. The Cherubim and Seraphim Society became very influential as African Christianity began developing its critique of both Catholicism and Vòdún traditions. It was also the model for celestial Christianity later in the 1940s. During the Great Depression, divisions started to appear in the national movement between the educated elites and the Merchants' Association over matters of communist ideology. The merchants argued that the elites' investment in colonial politics of African authenticity and intellectual exceptionalism had meant ignoring real material development issues, including support for entrepreneurs and economic and political autonomy. Let me take that paragraph again. During the Great Depression, divisions started to appear in the national movement between the educated elites and the Merchants' Association over matters of communist ideology. The merchants argued that the elite's investment in colonial politics of African authenticity and intellectual exceptionalism had meant ignoring real material development issues, including support for entrepreneurs and economic and political autonomy. They also argued that the elite's communist approach to anti-colonial resistance was imported, anti-business and unfit ideology for Africa. These debates foreshadow contested notions of culture and entrepreneurship among Beninese musicians in the 1990s. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, the state began using forced labor to obtain export crops and suspended local elections. In this environment of extreme scarcity and hardship, the Dahomean population was nevertheless strongly in support of the French against the Nazis, and the elites drew even closer to their identification with French nationalism. Many Dahomeans and others in France's colonies, served in the Allied armed forces, and some of them gained French citizenship for their service. During World War II, the Dahomean national movement essentially disappeared, subordinated to the allegiances of wartime, and it never truly rose to its former strength. When independence came in 1960, it was on France's terms. New Vòdún, new churches. While the Dahomean national movement was sidelined politically and economically during and after World War II, cultural resistance to colonization continued to flourish in New Vòdún communities through music and ritual, as practices were adapted for new realities by a new generation of participants. One of the chief developments during the 1940s was the arrival of New Vòdún cults from Ghana, such as those for Vòdún Tron, Kola Nut, and Mami Wata, the goddess of the sea. These cults came through the influence of Christian Science among Protestants in Ghana, and traveling fishermen brought the cults with them, first to Ouida. They bear a strong resemblance to the Aladura churches in Nigeria, which have also become influential in Benin. Fittingly, many of these cults make use of Ghanaian coastal genres of drumming like Abaja for their ceremonies, Abaja, which shares some common roots with other genres from the Aja 4 cultural region. Others draw from traditional popular genres from the villages around Porto Novo, Jebe. Often, urban youth had not been incorporated into the new structures of colonial education and had moved to the city for work, separating themselves from village family support systems. The New Vòdún from Ghana were also new to the city, so to speak, and represented access to a broader intra-African spiritual network of healing and prosperity. These new cults gave urban women and young men an outlet for a critique of the colonial state and the church without needing to confront the patriarchal structures of the older Vòdún practices, whether royal, ancestral, or interethnic. In contrast to older, ancestral, or interethnic Vòdún practices, these new cults were particularly focused on targeting witchcraft and promised a more individual orientation that met followers' needs for intervention in such areas as fertility, marital wealth, and protection from spiritual attack in the form of illness and accident. Needs for the realities of working in modern cities and modern economies. The Tron communities, in particular, became patrons of specific styles of popular drumming, like those from the fishing villages in the Mono region on Dahome's western seashore, like Abaja. There were new Christianities springing up in the post-war period as well, with the formation of the Celestial Church of Christ, founded in 1947 by Samuel Bilio Joseph Oshofa, the son of a Methodist minister from Nigeria who received a divine revelation to create a church to be the last boat to bring mankind to salvation. The Celestial Church of Christ was highly visible in Benin during my fieldwork, as crowded busloads of white-clad faithful travel the roads between Cotonou, Porto Novo, and Lagos. The communities are known for incorporating aspects of Vodou practice and other traditions into their worship services. This includes a focus on traditional revelation and material prosperity. This includes a focus on individual revelation and material prosperity that echoes some of the issues treated in the new Vodou cults like Vodou Tron and Mamiwata. The Celestial Church of Christ, along with the Cherubim and Seraphim Society, have been incredible patrons of music, sponsoring brass bands and choirs, and producing many excellent musicians who have crossed over to mainstream success. Notably, the independent churches make more use of Vodou-related styles like Baja and Jebe from the cults for the newer Vodou like Mamiwata, Tron, and Goro than they do the protected rhythms of royal ancestral interethnic Vodou like Nesuwe or Sapata, which was still tied into hierarchical networks of control and long-standing ritual regulations. This reflects the new church's constituency, usually non-royal, often non-Fon ethnic minority individuals who migrated from rural to urban settings for work. The Celeste Church makes use of many popular traditional styles too, like Mas, Gohun, Jogli and Ayo Pede, which are common in the recreational performances of public ceremonies and seasonal rhythm and seasonal festivals. These transformations of Vodou music and practice strengthen religious communities outside of officially sanctioned areas like the royal courts of Dahomey and Zobonu and the Catholic and mainline Protestant churches. By the mid-20th century in Dahomey, Vodou was a flexible constellation of practices that responded to the evolving needs of Dahomey's population, including pressures from urbanization, the rapid social and cultural changes brought on by colonization, and social class aspirations. The ancestral practices of the royal courts continued, and the educated elite remained largely tied to Catholic worship and schooling. But the new churches and new Vodou cults of the mid-20th century offered more contemporary and less hierarchical models for spiritual intervention, which reflected experiences of regional migration and the desire for class mobility. These new religious forms also reveal the creative potential for combining practices from Christianity, Islam, and the Vodou of other neighboring parts of Africa. The liturgical music of these communities brought all of these experiences together and became the expression of a new social class of urban working people, neither évolué nor indigene. Making space for this other class position. This other way of being was a particularly powerful counter to colonial religion and class binaries, and it was out of these communities that much of the post-colonial music scene developed in what later became Benin. Multiple temporalities. Every age, including the post-colony, Achille Mbembe writes, is in reality a combination of several temporalities. These temporalities are omnipresent when doing history and ethnography in post-colonial contexts. I found that to experience history in a post-colony like Benin Dahomey is to become accustomed to, but never quite make peace with, these slippages. To look back and listen to the music of pre-colonial Dahomey, its power dynamics, spiritual systems, vulnerabilities, and contradictions, is also to confront the frames that colonial and post-independence era actors use to construct and reconstruct this past for their own projects. The writing and reenactment of post-colonial Dahomean history speak back to colonization, even as this writing cannot escape the reality that in a post-colonial world, no knowledge, no language, no narrative, no value, category, or method entirely escapes being colonized. So the telling itself, the speaking of these names, the singing of their songs reopens the seam of old traumas, so that temporal boundaries can again be crossed, and things can again be made whole for a time. The music and ritual practice of vòdún underwent dramatic transformations during the formation of the Dahomean Empire, during the French colonization, and through the emergence of new forms of blended Afro-Christian liturgies. Throughout these changes, these spiritual practices have remained an outlet for the performance and commodification of emerging identities. These practices have for hundreds of years acted as mediators for the reconciliation of personal and collective trauma. Throughout the colonial project, Dahomey continued to adapt to political and economic changes. French colonization broke down traditional social structures and impacted Dahomean attitudes regarding culture and religion, although control of traditional religion and culture was never complete. Anti-colonial resistance in independent African churches and new vòdún cults created important models for Africanizing colonial traditions, while a complex and divided Dahomean national movement subordinated its needs to support the French in World War II. The post-war acknowledgement of citizenship and representative democracy in France's colonies left only a few steps to Dahomey's independence. On June 13, 1960, Dahomey successfully negotiated its independence in France. In Paris, Hubert Maga won the election in December later that year, but the timing of independence for Dahomey came some 20 years after the height of its national movement, and without resolving any of its very real problems of governance and economy, ranging from internal, regional, and class divisions to dependence on the colonial infrastructure for trade and education. The years after independence demanded a great deal of experimentation and problem solving, and yielded uneven results for the turbulent decades that followed in the 70s and 80s. In the following chapter, I show how musicians in independence-era Benin started looking to these pre-colonial and colonial histories for inspiration and representing it to themselves, to the country's leaders, and to the international sphere. Early generations of popular musicians in the 1950s were self-consciously modern to the point of making no obvious connection to traditional expressive practices, preparing to focus on Afro-diasporic musics like salsa, or African genres popular in France, such as Congolese soukous and Ghanaian highlife. It was a new phase in the process of sifting through the various heritages left to the post-independence generations, the beginning of Africanizing their colonial heritage.